You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYSHAX.
Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode of Supply Chain Secrets. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is the supply chain sage, Lars Jensen.
Hi all.
In today's episode, we are continuing our discussion on President Trump's impacts on supply chain. It's been a whirlwind of a month since President Trump took oath for the second time. In our previous episode, we spoke about tariffs, of course, the proposed legislation called Ships for America, and the Panama Canal. Definitely check out that episode if you haven't had a chance to already. But today we're going to be chatting a bit further about the tariffs. We're also going to touch on the Ukraine-Russia war and what happens to shipping if the conflict does resolve soon. We also received a few questions from LinkedIn, so we'll be going through those towards the end. And last but certainly not least, today marks a very historic day for the Supply Chain Secrets podcast. We have a virtual live audience in the recording studio with us. These were the smart folks that signed up to be able to ask Lars their burning logistics questions. If you weren't able to join today, we're going to be doing these recordings live moving forward on a weekly basis. So definitely sign up at nyshex.com/podcast. Our next episode recording will be on Tuesday, February 25th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So with all that, Lars, let's go ahead and jump into the tariffs. What is the latest and greatest on that?
The latest and greatest is, I think the technical term would be chaotic if implemented the way it is announced. The latest and greatest, the simple part is we now got tariffs coming into the US on steel and aluminum. For a lot of container shippers, that's not really all that relevant. But the one that is really worthwhile paying attention to is the announcement of reciprocal tariffs. That basically means you have to go through, look at every individual country in the world, and for that country at every individual commodity code, and then look at what is the tariff rule that country has upon the US versus what is the US charging at the other end. And the intention from the current administration is to then match whatever tariff the other country has on that commodity if it is higher. The reason why this can be an administrative nightmare is we are talking millions of lines of individual country commodity codes. Just the pre-study to get to this point is only expected to be done for the administration itself on April 1st, so we won't see any announcement until April 2nd at the earliest. As far as I've been able to find out, smaller versions of this have been contemplated in recent decades and usually then terminated again because of the sheer impracticality in terms of administrative burden to do it. And in terms of administrative burden, we could also see how the de minimis rule was abolished from China into US, so all goods below $800 have been exempt from any customs clearance. That was abolished, and 3 days later, the abolition was put on hold as someone in customs simply showed that if this is done, everything will grind to a halt in customs. They don't have the systems to actually cater to this. And that might be the problem with reciprocal tariffs as well. And that brings me more to the overall point here. It is at this point impossible for any shippers related to the US to plan for this, because it is de facto entirely unknown which commodities will and will not be hit, which countries will and will not be hit, by how much will they be hit if they are hit, and when will this go into effect. There is simply no predicting this. So for everyone out there, I mean, sure, there's still some front loading going on, but apart from that, keep calm. I was about to use the old English phrase, keep calm and carry on, but basically keep calm, wait until the dust settles so we see what gets actually implemented. Don't go out and try to desperately change your entire supply chain now, because no one really knows how those chips are going to fall. That's just a problem for the supply chain overall.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it seems like you can't prepare for what might happen just because day-to-day things seem to be changing.
No, and you can say, to put it in context, I mean, it's not new that we see tariffs changes either to the US, but also tariffs in other countries. That's par for the course. That's always been part of the supply chain. The difference this time is the speed of the changes. Usually when tariffs are being implemented, it's been announced months in advance, and once they've been announced, they get implemented exactly the way they have been announced. But as we've seen in the last 4 weeks, that is not the way the current administration operates. Things can be announced with just a few days of warning, just as they can then be retracted again with a few days of warning. So it's a different game.
Yeah. And it seems like we've also been seeing changes in the amount of the tariff too, week over week. They're kind of going back and forth between the price and which types of commodities.
They are, and you could say another practicality in the announcement that the White House made about reciprocal tariffs, which makes things even more complicated to predict where it will go, is that the perspective of the administration is that VAT in other countries are seen as tariffs as well. That is certainly not how tariffs are commonly understood anywhere, but that's the administration's view, which makes it yet more unpredictable. If this view is upheld, then we are going to talk massive tariffs. It's not uncommon, for example, in European countries at times to have VAT in excess of 20%.
And for our U.S. listeners that might not be as familiar with VAT, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, VAT is a value-added tax. I mean, take me, I sit here in Denmark, for example. We have a value-added tax, and that means everything, and I literally mean everything being sold is subject to a 25% value-added tax. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Danish produced goods, goods imported from the EU, goods imported from the US or from China, literally everything is subjected to a 25% value-added tax. So unlike a tariff, which is, you can say, something that you need to pay when it comes from country X, this applies to everything, including domestically produced goods.
So it's similar to a sales tax, but also if you're importing goods.
Yes, it goes on everything.
Okay. And then what do you think the impact on free trade agreements might be with these tariffs if they're implemented?
Yeah, that's another one of the uncertainties, because there is a web globally of different trade agreements. The US is part of different trade agreements. One of them is actually the trade agreement the first Trump administration made with Canada and Mexico. And the new tariffs that are coming are a complete violation of the terms of any of those trade agreements, which means it's suddenly left completely up in the air. Will this just be seen as individual violations of the trade agreement, or will the other countries that are part of those trade agreements simply pull out? And that will mean the entire trade agreement will disappear, which can again change tariffs on a lot of commodities that might not even be mentioned from the US administration presently.
Yeah, so there might be more downstream effects than they're even thinking about.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. And so in terms of like European importers and exporters, what's the general sentiment right now from them?
The general sentiment is one of hold off and wait and see. Nobody wants to make any major changes. Part of what I tend to see is an unwillingness to start already now contemplating moving factories to the US. I mean, some European countries already have that, which helps them quite a bit. But the ones that don't, they're not about to jump in and make that decision. First of all, they want to see the dust settle. Where does this actually land down? And some of them still have the perspective. If you're going to build a manufacturing unit in the US, it's probably a 10 to 15 year commitment. It's a lot of capex up front. It's a lot of investment. Do you really want to do that for a problem that might be only, now I say only in quotation marks, a 4-year problem?
Right. That partially answers a question that we got from one of our listeners. It was a two-parter. So the first one was, when would the market start to feel the impact of the tariffs? And then his second part of the question was, are shippers making plans to source from non-tariff countries?
Yeah. And the last one first, basically no, they're all sitting back biding their time. And if I was to put my money on any development here, that would be short term. Nothing is going to change again until everything, the dust settles and we know what the lay of the land is. Once we know what the lay of the land is, the first course of action for US importers will not be to rush to put up manufacturing in the US. It will be to sit down and say, okay, given these new tariffs, what is then the second cheapest alternative? If I'm sourcing, I mean, we usually use China as an example, but with the reciprocal ones, it could basically be anything. So let's make up a hypothetical example. You're importing a specific commodity from Vietnam that's now suddenly subject to a 20% tariff. That does not cause that importer to say, oh my God, now we're going to move manufacturing to the US. They're going to look at, okay, Can we still source from Vietnam, but maybe ship it via a third country, like it's done right now with Chinese goods via Mexico? What will that cost us? Or should we maybe source from Cambodia or from Thailand or someplace else? And they're going to look for what is the second cheapest alternative. Once they then found that, then we're going to see those trades shift. That in turn will set off another domino effect. Right now, most of the liner networks are in a state of flux as we are phasing in all the new networks. But once the landscape of tariffs settles down, that might change how some of this cargo flows. That means that some port calls might be skipped from the current network and others might be added. Again, hypothetical example because we don't know where this is going to land. But if, hypothetically, we get the 15% tariff across the border in Mexico, that could very well lead to some of the commodities that are right now being shipped into Mexico and then up to the US might be shipped to other countries in Central America or in the Caribbean or in Southeast Asia. And that would mean maybe you would see less capacity shipped into Mexico and more capacity to those other third countries. So we're going to see network adjustments. But that's not a short-term effect. That will only happen when we are sure what is the overall tariff landscape.
So it sounds like immediate impact, little to none, other than added stress and anxiety about what needs to be done. But longer term,
that's very well put. Yes, added stress and anxiety, but not much that can tangibly be done.
Yeah, the long term, you might see more shifts in capacity, how carriers are routing things, depending on if people are moving to different countries to manufacture their goods.
Yes, and just to be clear, this is not new. I can't remember the precise sequence, so take this more as a high-level one. But originally, many decades ago, you used to produce a lot of washing machines and dryers and all sorts of white goods in the US. Then Korea started to show up as a cheap sourcing area, so it moved over there, which led to US tariffs on Korea because they wanted to move manufacturing back to the US, but it didn't. Then it moved on to Taiwan because that was still cheaper. Then tariffs were placed on Taiwan, so it moved to Japan. Then tariffs were placed on Japan, then it moved to China. Now we put tariff on China in the first Trump administration, so it moved to Southeast Asia. So this is a repeating pattern. This is not new at all. I mean, everything we've known for the impact of tariffs for the last 50, 60 years is, at least in this case seen from a US perspective, does not lead to manufacturing moving to the US. It leads to goods either being produced elsewhere or routed via a third country where they can get a new label on, say, manufactured in this country. And the current round is unlikely to be any different. It's just more complex because it's happening so rapidly.
Yeah. Do you think there's alternative methods that would incentivize shippers to move their manufacturing to the US, like maybe subsidizing labor, or like, are there other ways that maybe that you're aware of where it's been tried in other countries and that's worked, or is this just...
You can say at the core of this is very, very simple. The driver of this is the US consumer. What is the US consumer willing to pay for goods down in the supermarket or the hardware store? That is what has driven outsourcing. For the longest time, you had a choice in the stores. Do you want to buy domestically produced goods or foreign sourced goods? And the consumers chose that they wanted to pay whatever was the cheapest. So at the end of the day, that is the driver. You can then put tariffs on, but that doesn't make US produced goods cheaper. It just makes the foreign goods more expensive. And then we get into this whole discussion that if this genuinely is implemented the way it's said, I'm not convinced it will be, but if it is, it's going to drive inflation. And then we're going to have a whole other episode at some point talking about what will inflation then do to container shipping volumes, especially if that triggers a rein in on consumer spending.
Yeah, that's a smart distinction. Well, it seems like we're kind of in a pattern of wait and see. But of course, as anything gets updated, we'll be on here talking about it, I'm sure. Any last parting advice for our importers related to the tariffs?
No, I would go back to the keep calm and carry on, at least for now. Monitor what is happening, but don't take any rash action.
Agreed. All right, so let's switch into the topic of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. How does that impact container shipping? Why does it matter to me as an importer?
This is going to sound slightly callous. It doesn't. We could talk at length about the impact and the severity of the Russia-Ukraine war in a geopolitical context, but if we narrow this down to container shipping specifically, this is close to being a non-issue. And I'm not saying that to be callous or anything, but when we look back 3 years ago when the war started, that also had basically no impact. And the reason it has such a limited impact is the overall containerized volumes. Also, when we looked at it just before the war, volumes into and out of Ukraine in containers from a global or from a European perspective is very small. And the same actually goes for Russia. So the overall volumes are small. Furthermore, Ukraine is serviced through the Black Sea. Russia is serviced through the Black Sea and up in St. Petersburg in the Baltics. That's at the outer edges of all the rotations of ships, which means there are no transshipment hubs. They're not a node in the major transshipment train at all. So the overall impact when the war started was relatively small, which means that if the war ends, the impact here would also be relatively marginal.
Are there any indirect impacts? I understand maybe container shipping directly, the trade routes don't line up with the major ones, but what else can we see?
Exactly. So for the indirect impact, this is then where we at least need to take a step down the geopolitical scene. What we're beginning to see is a rapid ramp up, especially here in Europe, in terms of increasing defense spending dramatically. That could have an indirect impact also on container shipping, depending on how this is done. If this is done through increased taxation, that could definitely put a curb on consumer spending and have a significant negative impact on container volumes. If it is done, however, through the lending of money, the impact on consumer spending would be marginal or not there at all. So it depends on how this is financed. But it could definitely be one of the trigger points of leading down to lower growth in Europe.
So you're saying that if the conflict ends, there's increased military spending in Europe? Can you explain that a bit more?
What is going on right now in Europe? I mean, this is where the European perspective is now very much different from than the perspective seen from the US administration. Seen from most of the European countries, there is not a belief that a long-term viable peace can be made with Russia over this. Even if there is a peace, I wouldn't call it peace process, but what's happening right now is that US and Russia they want to make a deal no matter what the Ukrainians say. If that leads to a cessation of hostilities, and that's called peace, the expectation in Europe is that Russia will use likely the next 5 years to regroup and rearm, and we're going to have another war in Europe. That is realistically what's on the table across the European governments right now. So they're looking at a very, very rapid ramp up in military spending.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, we're not necessarily hearing that in the news day to day in the US, so I appreciate that insight. So in terms of other trades, if the conflict does end, is there an impact in terms of capacity on rates, like anything at all that we should be thinking about?
No, you can say that's where the weird part is. Again, from a geopolitical stance, this is a major topic. But again, from container shipping, considering all the other uncertainties out there, this is really small potatoes, so to speak. We already spoke about the massive uncertainty around the tariffs. And the other uncertainty that looms very, very large here is still the Red Sea, where if we are optimistic, we can hope for a peaceful solution in the Middle East and we go back through the Red Sea. But one of the effects of going back to the Red Sea, not only will it be we get a massive injection of capacity, but it would also mean a temporary, very sharp drop in container demand from Asia to Europe. Because when we reopen the Suez routing, the supply chain contracts by 10 to 14 days. That means that all the inventories in Europe will suddenly be 10 to 14 days too large. And what will the importers do? They will, of course, stop a lot of their ordering in Asia until the inventories are right-sized. So once this happens, you're going to see a dramatic drop in Asia to Europe. Demand growth is going to turn negative quite substantially for a few months. And that's going to lead to an enormous roller coaster ride on the freight rates. And those uncertainties, the tariffs and the Red Sea, vastly outshines any direct or indirect impact right now from the Russia-Ukraine if we get a peace.
So, in terms of the Red Sea, I think I saw something about carriers starting to plan on increasing capacity or starting vessels moving through that area. Have you been hearing that or seeing that?
I haven't been seeing much tangible. I mean, the only one that came out, that was actually, I think it was yesterday, CMA CGM joined a small service that operates from India into the Red Sea. It's actually been operating since September by Saudi-based Folk Maritime and Oman-based Asiat Shipping. CMA CGM has now jumped on board and also added a ship. But in this case, we're talking India to Red Sea. We're not talking Asia-Europe services. We're talking ships around 2,000 to 3,000 TEU. I'm sure all the carriers, they definitely have their plans ready to go back through the Red Sea. But I would be surprised if they pull the trigger on it right now. Also for a different reason. The ceasefire has now been in effect for 4 weeks. It's only supposed to run 6 weeks. And when it expires, there's supposed to be a new deal for the next stage of the ceasefire. They were supposed to have begun negotiating that 2 weeks ago. They haven't. At best, they begin negotiating this week. So if we are optimistic, there might be a new deal for what happens after the 6 weeks within the next week or so. But if I was a carrier, I would not be committing to go back to the Red Sea right now with a risk that the ceasefire will stop 2 weeks into the future from now.
Right. Yeah, it seems pretty unpredictable at this point.
Yes.
Well, we've spent a good amount of time talking about, Trans-Pacific and Asia to Europe. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're seeing with transatlantic rates?
Transatlantic rates had actually held high for the longest time, and only in the last few weeks we've seen somewhat of a drop on the Atlantic rates. It is not quite clear right now what is causing that drop, but if I was to venture at least a hypothesis on that one, I think it's linked to the same weakness that we're now also seeing Asia, Europe, and Trans-Pacific. So not Chinese New Year related, obviously in the Atlantic, but also on the Atlantic we are seeing a reshuffling of some of the services as part of the new alliances coming into effect. That leads to operational challenges, and it leads to carriers having more of a focus on, while we're doing this, let's make sure we keep our market position, that we keep our market shares, and that adds a little bit of negative pressure to the market.
What have you seen in terms of the capacity changes due to the new alliance?
It has not been all that extreme, and they were better than expected in terms of managing also blank sailings in the wake of Chinese New Year. You can of course say not good enough with the weakness we've seen in spot rates over the last few weeks, certainly not, but better than expected.
Okay. And then maybe we'd also touch on the forgotten stepchild, so to speak, of the backhaul trade that doesn't usually get the spotlight.
Yeah. The backhaul trades continue to just weaken basically week over week. They have for a year or so. Some of them, especially the backhaul from Europe back to Asia, of course saw a bump a year ago when the Red Sea crisis first emerged, but after that it has just been falling. And the disparity between headhaul and backhaul rates just keep growing larger. That's not really surprising, because one of the driving forces has always been the trade imbalance. And if there's anything we have seen, not just the last year, but over the last 5 years, the trade imbalances have just grown larger and larger. I was about to say, in the old days, here we're talking 5-10 years back, the rule of thumb on the Pacific, for example, was a 2-to-1 imbalance. Every time we ship 2 containers into the US and the Pacific, there's cargo for 1 going back. That is now more than 1 in 3. So the imbalance is severe. And that also means pricing dynamics are fundamentally different. You can have high rates, as we have seen over the last year, because of capacity shortages on the main headhaul trades. But on the backhaul trades, this does not manifest itself as high rates anymore, simply because it's just driven by, it's a repositioning trade. It is more a cost consideration than anything else. So the supply-demand dynamics that rule pricing on the headhaul is completely detached by the dynamics that we see on the backhaul.
Interesting. Okay, so we actually have a question from one of our listeners here. They are asking, so Trump met with the Indian Prime Minister recently, and they're wondering if there's anything material that we might be able to expect coming from that meeting.
Yeah, you say, first off, it's same with the tariffs. Let's see what gets implemented. But that aside, even if Trump hadn't met with Prime Minister Modi, if you look at the developments a little over a year ago, there was a sharp increase in trade, especially from India to the US. And you could even see that just prior to the Red Sea crisis, a couple of new direct container line services directly from India to the US East Coast were being established, which was a very clear sign that trade was indeed growing. India was increasingly seen as a place to also place production rather than the traditional places either in China or Southeast Asia. That is a development I would have expected to continue to grow regardless of whether Trump had met with Modi or not.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing a lot with our shippers as well. It's definitely a split between Asia, Southeast Asia, and then India as well.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that is all of the questions that we have for today. Thank you everyone for joining and for listening in. We'll be back at this again next week. So if you would like to sign up for the live episode, please go to our website, nishex.com/podcast, and you can sign up there. But until then, happy shipping.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NiceShacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.